Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a medical and science-focused podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Metabolic Link. Really excited to be sitting here today because we've got fascinating topics to talk about, all involving sleep, light exposure, cardiometabolic function. But first, I'm Victoria Field, your co-host, along with my fellow co-host, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, Dr. Angela Poff. Really looking forward to today's discussion. Why don't we kick it off with this first paper all about shift workers, really. Daytime eating prevents mood vulnerability in night work. Angela, do you want to lead us through this study and what the researchers found?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this was a paper that was published in July 2022, and it was published in PNAS Neuroscience, which is a great journal. The authors come from Harvard and University of Cologne in Germany. So a great group doing this work. They clearly are very well established to do some really elegant studies in circadian biology, which is pretty cool in humans. So this study was basically set up to determine if the time that an individual eats when they're on a nighttime kind of work schedule, like shift workers would experience, if that dictates susceptibility to mood vulnerability. So it's known that shift workers have a greatly increased risk of developing depression and anxiety, actually as high as like 25 to 40% increased risk, which is very high. And there's not really a lot being done or even recommended on how to best address this in this particular population. So there was also data previously showing that daytime only eating. So if an individual is a shift worker working through the night but still only eats during the daytime hours when the sun is out, can prevent the glucose intolerance that is observed in shift workers. So shift workers also experience glucose intolerance. So aside from this, increased risk for these mood vulnerabilities, they also have glucose intolerance. And so daytime only eating in this population can prevent that glucose intolerance that occurs in this population. And they're wondering, can that also impact susceptibility to mood vulnerability? And so this was a trial that was performed in healthy participants, and they basically, these individuals were in this laboratory setting for I think a total of like 18 days, because they had a 4-day lead into to get their circadian rhythms misaligned, and then a 14-day protocol in which they were on their particular rhythm. And so the researchers intentionally misaligned the participants' central circadian clock by exposing them to 28-hour day cycles. And so they did this over a period of 4 days, which then by the end of the 4th day, they were 12 hours off the normal circadian cycle. So, and then these individuals were randomized. Half of them were assigned to eating only during the daytime hours, and half were assigned to eating in daytime and nighttime. Now, they kept everything the same except the time that these individuals ate. So even calories were controlled, the diets were very specifically controlled, and everything except when these individuals ate. So they found that those, and I guess, so they said, and I thought this was interesting, that apparently it's very common in shift workers to eat during both the nighttime and daytime hours. And I wonder if that's kind of like, so I'm married to a shift worker. My husband is an ER doctor. He works exclusively night shifts. And so when they were describing that, I was like, that's interesting. But I guess, I think about how my husband will come home and then like he wants to stay up and be with the family too and kind of participate in some of our normal stuff with like our kids who are obviously awake during the day and myself. And so, I guess in retrospect, that is something even, my husband does. And so
I used to do as well. I used to be a shift
too?
worker writer for an NBC affiliate, writing the morning news. Mm-hmm. And you want to be a part of like daytime life with
Yes.
everybody. So, of course, you're eating around the clock just to feel normal,
Right.
whatever that is. But
Exactly.
yeah.
So anyways, that surprised me at first, but I think it makes sense. So that is the norm, I guess. Most shift workers do eat during both daytime and nighttime. And so what they found was that the individuals who ate during both daytime and nighttime hours had an increase in depression scores by 26.2% and an increase in anxiety scores by 16.1% compared to their baseline. That's a really big shift in a 14-day period. And they didn't see that occur in the group that was daytime eating only. So even though these individuals are going through a very disruptive experience, their central circadian clock really being dramatically shifted, just the simple difference of not eating during the nighttime hours as well was associated with, there was no association in terms of increased risk. Now, of course, this is all correlation. There's no causality being established here, but it was really striking what they found. And to kind of support even further, this really might be something substantial going on. They found that the larger the circadian misalignment, the greater the effect. So as circadian misalignment increased, that effect was observed even more. So there's a lot of shift workers around the world. I should have looked up the number. I know it's a significant percentage of the population. I feel like this could have really
huge dramatic effects. And I one of the top things that comes to my mind is what kind of role does the gut microbiome play in sort of dance with circadian misalignment? And because we already know from some research that dramatic circadian shifts do affect microbiota communities from some of the research. So, with this kind of study, I would be so curious to maybe them testing their gut microbiome changes and things along those lines. Could have been really fascinating, I think, to add to the mix.
Yeah, and that is one area that the authors were kind of speculating as to why this might be occurring, what mechanisms might be at play. Microbiome was one of them that they mentioned. And so it's been shown that circadian disruption will perturb the microbiome. So you see a change in the species that are present, and some data has suggested a shift towards a more pro-inflammatory microbiota. And then also they mentioned when you have a shift from the normal gut flora, you basically have a reduction in what they're calling microbiome-mediated functional pathways. So our microbiome plays a very normal role to our physiology and especially our brain function. So the gut-brain axis is very important. And the microbiome is responsible for, synthesizing neurotransmitters like serotonin. I mean, a lot of the serotonin in our body is made by the gut microbiome. So if you're shifting the gut microbiome towards a different, composition, you're essentially, and to a composition that has a negative outcome, perhaps with, an inflammatory kind of composition, you're also just depleting the microbiota that is supposed to be performing these routine, aspects of our physiology to help support brain function. So it's kind of like a double whammy in that regard.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
And I always think about the liver too, because the liver is kind of like when we eat carbohydrates, it doesn't go directly into the bloodstream per se, but the liver functions as kind of like a carburetor, if you're into that, and then it tightly regulates the flow of glucose, and that glucose could be carbs you ate from the previous day, right? So the liver is the master regulator of metabolism, but there's a lot of emerging data on the liver and circadian biology too, and in context of time-restricted feeding. So I think about how the liver, the dynamics between the microbiome and the liver function and how that comes into play from a hormonal standpoint, because the liver is under hormonal control. Yeah. And if these people doing shift work are like sleeping in a blackout room, or are they exposed to light, and if that was controlled in this, or they talked about that.
Yeah, so I don't think it was a blackout room, but they did very tightly control all of the the diet, the light, the cycle. So even the group that wasn't eating during the nighttime cycle, they were awakened for that same period of time that the other group was awake. They just didn't eat during that time. So they did a really great job like designing this, in my opinion, to really suss out the exact impact of if you're eating during these nighttime hours as well.
Fragmented sleep, though, that must have been rough to participate in that. Wake up, eat. Really difficult. Did they also measure for melatonin and that whole process of like what happened between the groups?
There wasn't a difference between melatonin between the groups.
Oh, super interesting. Yeah, because obviously that's tied all in with insulin, and it's just this whole other area. Wow, that's a really fascinating study and really helpful, because I think I would assume, at least from my own experience in this kind of work, it becomes really confusing as to what is the best to like optimize your health, even if you have this overnight work. Does it make a lot of sense to fast during that window of time? I mean, I'm sharper when I don't eat anything, but it throws in this whole different element when you consider night versus day and circadian rhythms and gut microbiome. It's really fascinating research.
Well, you mentioned insulin, and they did say that they think insulin signaling may have played a role in this. Right. So one thing they mentioned was that there has been preclinical research looking at neuronal specific insulin receptor knockout mice. So what that means is they've taken a strain of mice and they have completely knocked out expression of insulin receptor only in the neurons. So you have insulin receptor expression everywhere else, but in the neurons you don't. And what they see is in these animals, they exhibit mitochondrial damage and dysfunction and oxidative stress in some really important brain regions that are involved in emotional processing, like the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. And in those animals, they go on to develop and exhibit depression and anxiety behaviors, even in animals. And that's from just the elimination of insulin receptor in neurons, which is really interesting, because we think of emotions being a very complicated, higher order process, and it is, of course, but to think that just the knockout of insulin receptor can essentially initiate that behavior change, that mood vulnerability in animals is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
No mention of sympathetic tone or HRV or heart rate, because typically that these things activate, and it'll kind of lead into the paper I'll be discussing, but the activation of the sympatho-excitatory response, a decrease in HRV, very consistent with hyperarousal.
Right. Yeah, the light sort of effects keeps you
up. I
up.
could see that sort of their cortisol. Did they measure cortisol? So cortisol, like these things, I think would be important factors, especially with the insulin resistance, cardiometabolic parameters.
Yeah.
It'd also be interesting to know what they were feeding them specifically.
Yeah, so they did mention it. I think it was, a pretty like standard kind of diet, 45 to 55% carbs, normal kind of percentage of fat and protein. So I think it was I guess what the recommended kind of macronutrient
be interesting
would be
to do that while on a ketogenic diet and compare the two and see if there's any difference or protective effect potentially in comparison. But that's a really interesting study because it affects so many people. I mean, both of these papers really affect so many people. The other paper we're going to talk about probably affects the majority of the population, I think, because there is a high percentage of people who actually sleep with the light on. This study is called Light Exposure During Sleep Impairs Cardiometabolic Function. And I think it's something like nearly 40% of the population actually sleeps with some sort of lamp or light on in the room, whether it be they don't like the dark or TV. Yeah. Totally, yes. That's in that grouping as well. And I know people. So this is going to be really interesting for you if you happen to sleep with the light on, because these researchers found some fascinating they had some fascinating findings here. Dom, do you want to kick this one off and kind of run us through what this looks like?
Yeah, and I've been very interested in light in general, synchronizing circadian biology to optimize metabolic health. I think it's it's been an overlooked field, and a lot of influencers and researchers are now bringing attention to this. So title of this being Light Exposure During Sleep Impairs Cardiometabolic Function. So really looking at kind of like the dark side of light, pun intended, I guess.
Right.
So we have, this paper was also a PNAS paper, high impact journal, great group of people, Ivy Mason being the first author, Phyllis Z, senior author, and it was done at Northwestern, the University of the Feinberg School of Medicine, in collaboration with the chronobiology program with that studies sleep and circadian disorders, also in collaboration with the Division of Sleep Medicine at Harvard Medical School. So it was a pretty simple study, a pretty elegant study in my mind, and it was a short study. These studies are not super easy to do. Did my PhD in a sleep pulmonary critical care, which is also a sleep medicine, and I know polysomnography and organizing and coordinating logistically everything that's done in this study appears kind of simple from a methodological point of view, but I know I can appreciate all the work that went into this. So there was 20 subjects that were selected for this particular study, and they experienced, they were monitored over 2 nights of sleep. 20 subjects, 10 of them went into the study design where they were exposed to, through the course of 1 night, dim light. They did not have a zero light, so we were just discussing which they had a zero. But it was, relatively speaking, it was very low level of light. It's under 3 lux, which could be a night light. It could be a bright alarm clock or something like that. Would kind of fit into that. Yeah, a full moon if you have a skylight or something in your room. So a little bit of light, but correlating to what is typically experienced. So 1 night of dim light, the first group had, and then 1 night of what would be considered room light, 100 lux of total light. And then the second group just had 2 nights of dim light. They're the comparison group. And the study design was pretty simple in regards to looking at cardiometabolic function and biomarkers. The morning homeostatic model of assessing insulin resistance, a HOMA-IR. They did a 2-hour glucose tolerance test. They were given 75 grams of glucose and looked at the 30-minute insulin area under the curve was part of that. They did look at melatonin, and so that was the sort of the main things that they looked at. And then with the polysomnography, they looked at the different stages of sleep, from 4 stages of sleep, and slow wave being delta sleep or N3, and then REM sleep stage 4. They also looked at the HRV and sympathetic tone. So getting into a little bit of background before kind of setting up the rationale for this study. So, nighttime light has been a big problem. There was a number of studies, and they reference 7 different studies looking at nighttime light and human health and well-being. And self-reported artificial light exposure in the bedroom during sleep has a profound effect on metabolic health and also weight and body composition. For example, for women, it was a small nightlight in the room, having the TV on, was associated with much higher incidence, significantly higher levels of obesity is associated with this. And this finding suggests, some of the previous work, that the findings suggest that the bedtime light environment has a very significant negative influence on metabolic regulation. So they go on, the intro to it has a number of studies that I was not aware of, but really sets the stage for this very simple short study that was done. The hypothesis of the study was that room light exposure, specifically not even that bright, 100 lux, during habitual nighttime sleeping would be associated with insulin resistance using HOMA-IR. They also do the Matsuda insulin sensitivity index, and in response to the glucose tolerance test, and they measure melatonin. So in addition, they hypothesized that the mechanisms of the light-induced metabolic changes would reduce the sleep quality, specifically the total sleep time. They're looking at sleep efficiency. They're looking at slow wave sleep, and then the number of arousals throughout the night. But really looking at the second hypothesis was to look at the melatonin suppression, if that was something, but also to kind of correlate this to arousal from the perspective of heart rate variability, and sympathetic tone. So during the actual sleep period. So the data was, for a single night of sleep disruption, fairly impressive. So looking at the HOMA-IR, I guess the big thing that, or just taking a step back, the age of the subjects was 26 years, and they randomized. The BMI 23, so they were in good cardiovascular shape. They had a normal sleep time of 7 hours. So normal in every aspect, so they were not compromised from a metabolic standpoint. So which you could probably perceive that these results would be greatly exacerbated in those that were trending towards being more obese or insulin resistant, or perhaps even type 2 diabetic. So I think the most significant sort of results that they showcase here was that the early phase, the 30 minutes for the first part of the glucose tolerance test, that the area under the curve of insulin was significantly higher. And the graphs really show significantly higher with room light exposure for one night. And I think that's pretty profound, especially considering that this was only one night, and many people experience multiple nights of sleep disruption or bright light during sleep, and so they were the graphs kind of show a lot of variability and somewhat of a modest effect on the glucose levels. Were trending higher with room light compared to the dim light, and then the insulin levels at different time points were with the glucose bolus, but when we look at the area under the curve and suggesting the total amount of insulin that was released, it was significantly higher. So this is
wild.
And these were subjects that were kind of normal in every aspect from a metabolic health standpoint. So
That's
again,
pretty significant in terms of increasing heart rate, causing some insulin resistance, decreasing HRV. Yep. All of these things are, key to, cardiometabolic health. And like you said, it's just one night. If we can imagine over the course of just 2 weeks what that looks like, and then also layer in light before bedtime on top of all of that that so many people get.
And they were sleeping. I mean, there was a decrease. It's probably good to know that there was an overall decrease in the slow wave in the delta, and also I believe a decrease in REM. But they were sleeping throughout the night, so they were getting sleep, but they had a greater increase in stage 2 sleep, or the N2, and suggesting that they're not really making that transition into the stage 3 and stage 4 and kind of staying in, stage 2 sleep is restorative sleep, but it's not as much as you would get with, stage 3 and stage 4. So, and then the overall, the heart rate variability, or the heart rate kind of varies throughout the night, but it was definitely trending to be, I don't know if they gave the actual percentages, but about 10% higher throughout the night. So just being exposed to light, maybe it's coming through the lids of the eye or your skin or whatever, just being in that light environment produces a hyperarousal that's activating the sympathetic nervous system, and activation of sympathetic nervous system you would presume, they didn't measure it here, but that would enhance the release of catecholamines, cortisol would be elevated, and this is likely contributing to some of the metabolic effects of the biomarker, specifically insulin under the curve. So,
and I thought
mechanistically it would be really interesting. It's not melatonin, so
Thanks.
I would
the same.
definitely expect
Yeah.
a melatonin suppression, but maybe that would be a more cumulative thing that would happen over time. But
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting because, like you said, they saw that increase in the insulin, the area under the curve, in the early acute phase of the oral glucose tolerance test. So when we talk about area under the curve, it's basically looking at the total amount of insulin released over the amount of time that it's being looked at. And so in this, in particular, so the total insulin over the entire oral glucose tolerance test was similar, but that early acute phase, specifically the first 30 minutes, it was higher in the group that was exposed to room light. And this is actually used classically as like a marker of pancreatic beta cell function. So having a higher early acute phase insulin secretion is associated with beta cell dysfunction and is a predictor of type 2 diabetes onset. So, they were saying that basically, even in people with both normal fasting glucose, normal 2-hour oral glucose tolerance tests, that if they have this higher early acute phase insulin response, it is still a predictor of type 2 diabetes. And so there's implications for maybe in people who are exposed regularly to nighttime light. Maybe there's a link to increased risk of type 2 diabetes because of that mechanism of the early acute phase insulin response.
Well, this could be like a major potential contributor to our health as a society. I mean, you're looking at like metabolic disease is at an all-time high. We talk a lot about nutrition, but sleep clearly is such an important player when it comes to glucose metabolism and just cardiometabolic function, but homeostasis and health in general is important for everything. So these kinds of studies are really helpful in making me feel better about my crazy nighttime routine to improve sleep quality.
Sleep hygiene, and I, growing up, I would, go over and sleep over other people's house. We always shut the TV off, to go to bed, but a lot of people just fall asleep with the TV on, and use the TV to fall asleep, to sort of anesthetize themselves, to fall asleep. But I don't think there was an appreciation for this 20, 30, definitely not like 40 years ago when I was a kid growing up. It seems like, just it was a big thing to have your TV in your room, just keep it on and just go to sleep with that on it. But I think, getting more attention into the interplay between circadian biology, light, and cardiometabolic health and metabolic health in general, and probably brain health too. This needs to be put on the radar of people who are doing this. And it might be, if people are especially on the threshold, the difference between diabetic and non-diabetic could just be sleep hygiene. And
Can you
especially,
imagine?
in the context of, sleep is also, shift workers have higher levels of cancer. Yeah. We know that certain cancers, whole host of cancers, are linked pathophysiologically to impaired metabolic health. Yeah. So just think about it in the context of cancer and brain health and Alzheimer's.
And it's so interesting to think about how dramatically our exposure to light has changed. Like we think evolutionarily. I mean, later, past just a couple hundred years ago, humans were almost never exposed to significant light during nighttime for all of human history. And I actually I've read a really fascinating book that was basically like all about how the world worked in human, behavior before artificial light, and how that impacted every aspect of like our society and our culture and your health and all of it. And it was so interesting, and it's really strange to think of how dramatically that has shifted just since we now have artificial light and everything has changed, because now you can do things when previously you kind of just, shuttered the windows and locked in for the night.
Yeah, or just let the night lead the way and go to sleep and then wake up with the sun without an alarm clock. That, is very few people are able to do that. It's something that I've tried to get back into the routine of like allow for the sun to naturally wake you up and you stop eating when the sun goes down really helps improve sleep quality, I've found. And
Can you tell that to my 2-year-old?
yes, that's a little harder for sure. I mean, parents, like, it's a totally different ball game, 100%. But I do think there's like some things that can potentially be really helpful in like my crazy sleep hygiene.
Yeah, tell us about your
protocol.
sleep hygiene protocol.
Well, yeah, and I'd love to hear, Dom, yours
Shut
as
off
well.
all the lights and everything when the
Yeah,
sun goes down?
you
Or just wear your blue
we're
blocking
just
glasses?
candles. It's candles. I'm kidding. No, we basically just, obviously turn down the lights, like dim everything after dinner, try to eat like 2-3 hours before you go to bed, to allow for that rest and digest kind of to take place. I've tried so many different experiments with food before bed, and that's by far been the best for me. In terms of HRV, I see like dramatic increase in that overnight and decrease in my heart rate much sooner. Either getting the blue light, the space glasses on, the blue light blocking glasses. We also have red lights in the house that we'll turn to like dim that crazy blue light that we have in here that's sucking my energy dry. Not watching, things that are stimulating right before bed, or reading things that are, like the news and things like that right before you go to sleep. There's so many different, I don't drink alcohol. There's so many different things that impact sleep that you don't even necessarily like think about. Sometimes we'll do like, a bath, those kinds of things. But there are so many like little steps you can take that really make a big difference. Even granted, I don't have kids, so I can't speak to it, but maybe getting the kids involved with could be a fun process. Everyone puts on their space glasses and blocks the light out. That's one thing, right? Dom, how about you?
3 things that are really important is just really bright light in the morning. So getting that burst of sun as it's coming up. I mean, we live in Florida.
Barefoot, right?
Yeah, barefoot, go outside, check on the cows, walk to the pasture, grounding myself.
Play in the dirt, gut microbiome.
Yeah, but it's that really intense bright light in the morning, I think, kind of sets the stage for syncing your circadian biology to the day. And then at nighttime, we have like a refurbished jacuzzi, big concrete structure that we just got running and getting heat. So it's kind of analogous to sauna. Mm-hmm. So taking a hot bath, hot shower, sauna, jacuzzi or whatever, elevating your body temperature for a little bit and then getting out, and then the vasodilation helps your body dump that heat. Yep. So I just go from jacuzzi to the pool and swim and just kind of, and then keep the temperature at like 67 in our bedroom, and that helps tremendously with sleep latency. So your body has to drop your temperature at least 1 degree for you to transition into sleep, and you can facilitate that by just keeping your bedroom cool. So bright light, reducing your body temperature, and also just general stimulation. I do wear the blue blocking glasses at nighttime when I watch Netflix. I do eat at night though. I have the heavy meal 3 or 4 hours before, but I snack. It's like 0 carbs up until dinner, and then I'll have some fruit or some keto ice cream pudding kind of thing.
Nice. That's awesome.
So I do eat, but
the temperature thing though, I think is like really critical. I think a lot of people don't realize that. My husband likes it like a meat locker status in our bedroom, and and honestly, I complained at first, but then it was like my sleep quality was going through the roof. We'll also, this is a little, I guess, looked strangely at, we actually will not sleep in the same bedroom, even though we're happily married. We will literally, if we have something coming up important, we'll sleep in separate rooms, because we are that. Your significant other can totally keep you up at night from movement to whatever, and it's actually one of the best things you could do for your marriage. Not that this is a marriage podcast, but I'm just saying it's been helpful for us.
Your total. So just by wearing devices, my wife wears an Oura, I wear Oura, this is a Fitbit, but total sleep time and sleep efficiency and even the stages of sleep are highly correlated with your partner. And I don't know if there's a study on that, but I can tell you from experience, we always wake up and we check, and it's just like you can almost overlay the total sleep time, sleep efficiency, and even latency to sleep, falling asleep is highly correlative. So
totally.
So
or the recording of them snoring, and when you woke up.
Yes, that's right.
I always
tape my mouth too. for sleep.
yeah, well, we could go.
Breathing, so that's
Maybe we'll cover that.
Yeah,
We can go into that. Yes, we occasionally dabble in that as well.
I always wonder, so my husband works nights, but he, isn't working every night. So if he has a couple of days off in between shifts, like he switches back to like daytime and then he switches back to nighttime. And sometimes it's like rapid turnaround. And I mean, just watching him is like dizzying to me. I know it has to be terrible, but but it kind of makes me think, I wonder, like, because obviously, there's data showing that just being out of sync with the kind of natural circadian rhythm associated with the sun is negative. But I wonder, which is worse? Like, switching back for some short amount of time or not at all? Is it worse to switch back and forth? I don't know. I've never looked into
Does he wear a sleep
data.
Monitor?
No.
And we should get a CGM on him.
Oh, it would be terrifying, I'm sure. No, and then he has like Victoria saw today, he came off a shift this morning, and we saw him before we were leaving this morning. He was coming home from work, and he had a meeting in like an hour and a half because his hospital administration have their meetings during the normal business hours, so he had to like stay up for that, or sometimes he'll sleep for like an hour and then wake up to be in a meeting and then sleep for like 2 hours. And
oh man, I don't know how he switches back and forth so easily. He must black out the room when he goes to sleep. I would think. No?
Oh no, literally.
Wow.
It's bizarre. I mean, he's a special one. It's strange.
He's a dim light or
like,
a lot of light kind of sleeper.
He could literally.
Really? Wow.
I mean.
I tried to get him on the podcast to talk about this because he's a very
rare,
amazing human being.
Yeah. It's strange, but I don't know.
Let's get some data from him first. So we'll put a CGM on him and look at his glucose variability. And he doesn't wear any kind of device for sleep, no?
No, he doesn't.
We got to do that too. Yeah.
That'd be very interesting to find out.
He can sleep anywhere, anytime.
That's amazing. And then meanwhile, you have people like, us where it's, I was telling you, and if we go to a hotel, we have to tape the like fire alarm lights and unplug the phones because it's like super, I guess we're super sensitive. We're, getting more light through our eyelids. We have thin eyelids, apparently. I'm not sure what's going on, but it's so wild how this is such an important topic, yet we're, there needs to be more conversation, I think, especially even from maybe your physician when you go in, like, how's your sleep quality? Like, that's not really something that's often asked, but clearly the, research is showing us how important, critically important it is. And maybe this is one of the biggest contributors towards the metabolic dysfunction of our society, really. I mean, it's kind of wild to think about.
Psychological health. Like on the drive in, I was listening to NPR and they were talking about going through menopause, and one of the people that they're interviewing was saying that the depression, anxiety, and things were tightly correlated to sleep quality. And that was the hormonal dysregulation that's associated with the night sweats and things like that were disrupting sleep. And then that was influencing these psychological measures, and it wasn't the hormones per se, but it was the hormone dysregulated sleep disruption that was actually contributing to that. So, and I think with nighttime eating, with people working all day and just eating a big meal before they go to bed, and then that disrupting their sleep. So sleep, I think, there's a dark side of light too. So keeping that light on at night.
I love
that.
that.
The title of this episode.
The dark side of the moon. No, it's very true and super fascinating. And we'll continue to cover all of the research that comes out with sleep and its relationship to metabolic health and how we can improve that and all improve our sleep hygiene, because at the end of the day, it's super important. Well, if you guys want to check out these papers, you can find it in the description of this podcast. Make sure you subscribe if you want to join us for more research on metabolic health and metabolic-based therapies. We'll be covering as much as we can each episode. And of course, leave us a review if you like this podcast so we can keep doing more of them. And thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you guys soon.
Thanks.